The morning sun cast long shadows across the military base as Elena Martinez quietly made her way to the uniform repair workshop. Her footsteps echoed softly on the concrete walkway, barely audible above the distant sounds of soldiers beginning their daily routines. At 28 years old, Elena had been working as a seamstress on the base for nearly 3 years, yet she remained virtually invisible to most of the personnel who passed through her small workshop tucked away in the corner of the supply building. Elena's hands were her most remarkable feature, though few people ever noticed them. Calloused from years of precise needlework, they moved with the grace of a concert pianist across fabric and thread. Her fingers could detect the slightest imperfection in a seam, the smallest tear that needed mending, or the exact tension required for a patch that would hold under the most demanding conditions. She had learned her craft not in any formal school, but in her grandmother's kitchen in a small village outside San Antonio, where she spent countless afternoons watching weathered hands transform scraps of cloth into beautiful quilts and sturdy work clothes. The workshop itself was a testament to Elena's quiet efficiency. Shelves lined the walls from floor to ceiling, filled with spools of thread arranged by color and weight. Bolts of various fabrics stood at attention in one corner, while another corner housed her collection of patches, insignia, and military decorations that soldiers had brought to be properly attached or repaired. Her workspace was immaculate, with every tool in its designated place. The industrial sewing machine hummed softly when in use, a sound that had become as familiar to Elena as her own breathing. Most soldiers who visited her workshop were polite but distant. They would drop off their uniforms, specify what needed to be done, and return later to collect their items. Few bothered to learn her name, despite the fact that her work was consistently praised throughout the base. Elena preferred this anonymity. It allowed her to focus entirely on her craft, to lose herself in the meditative rhythm of needle and thread, stitch after perfect stitch. On this particular Tuesday morning, Elena was working on a sergeant's dress uniform that had suffered damage during a ceremonial parade. The gold braiding along the shoulder had come loose, and several buttons needed to be replaced with exact military specifications. As she worked, her mind wandered to her childhood, when her grandmother would tell her stories about the importance of taking pride in one's work, no matter how small or unnoticed it might seem. Every stitch you make, her grandmother had said, her voice carrying the wisdom of 8 decades, is a promise to the person who will wear what you create. When a soldier puts on a uniform you have repaired, they carry your work into whatever challenges they may face. Make sure your promise is one of strength and care. Elena had carried these words with her through every repair, every alteration, every seemingly insignificant task that came her way. She understood that her work, while hidden behind the scenes, played a vital role in maintaining the pride and professionalism of the men and women who served their country. The morning passed quietly as Elena worked through a stack of uniforms that had been brought in over the weekend. There was a private's combat uniform with a torn pocket that needed reinforcing, a lieutenant's jacket with missing rank insignia, and several pairs of trousers that required hemming for new recruits. Each piece received Elena's full attention, as if it were the most important item she had ever worked on. Around midday, Elena paused to stretch her back and rest her eyes. The afternoon light streaming through the small window cast a golden glow across her workspace, highlighting the intricate patterns she had been stitching. It was during this moment of quiet reflection that she heard heavy footsteps approaching her workshop. The sound was different from the usual hurried pace of soldiers picking up their uniforms. These steps were measured, deliberate, carrying an authority that made Elena instinctively straighten her posture. The door to her workshop opened, and Elena looked up to see a figure silhouetted against the bright hallway light. As her eyes adjusted, she recognized the distinctive uniform of a high-ranking officer. Stars gleamed on the collar, and the bearing of the man who entered commanded immediate respect. This was General William Hayes, the base commander himself, a man whose presence on the base was both revered and feared by those under his command. General Hayes was a career military officer in his mid-50s, with graying hair and steel blue eyes that seemed to miss nothing. He had served in multiple combat deployments and had earned his rank through a combination of tactical brilliance, unwavering dedication, and the respect of his peers. His reputation preceded him wherever he went, and soldiers would often stand a little straighter and speak a little more carefully when he was nearby. Elena had seen the general from a distance on several occasions during base ceremonies and inspections, but he had never visited her workshop before. His presence filled the small space, making it feel even more cramped than usual. She stood quickly, wiping her hands on her work apron before offering a respectful nod. "General Hayes, sir. How can I help you today?" Elena's voice was steady despite the unexpected nature of this visit. She had learned long ago to remain calm under pressure, a skill that served her well both in her work and in life. The general's eye swept across the workshop, taking in the organized shelves, the careful arrangement of tools, and the quality of the work visible on Elena's current projects. He seemed to approve of what he saw, but his expression remained serious and somewhat guarded. "Ms. Martinez, isn't it?" he asked, his voice carrying the authority of command but softened by what seemed like genuine courtesy. "I've heard excellent things about your work from several of my officers. They tell me you have a particular talent for repairs that others might consider impossible." Elena felt a flutter of pride at the recognition, but she kept her expression humble. "I do my best, sir. Every uniform deserves to be maintained to the highest standard." General Hayes nodded, then reached into a garment bag he had been carrying. What he withdrew made Elena's breath catch in her throat. It was a dress uniform jacket, but not just any jacket. This was clearly a vintage piece, probably dating back several decades, with intricate detailing and craftsmanship that was no longer common in modern military uniforms. The fabric was a deep navy blue, with gold threading that caught the light as the general held it up for inspection. "This belonged to my father," General Hayes said, his voice taking on a softer tone. "He served with distinction in Vietnam, and this uniform saw him through some of the most important moments of his career. It's been in storage for years, but I recently decided that I would like to wear it for an upcoming ceremony honoring veterans of that conflict." Elena moved closer to examine the jacket, her trained eye immediately identifying several areas that would need attention. The gold threading had come loose in places, and there were small tears in the fabric that spoke of age and careful storage that hadn't quite prevented the ravages of time. Most concerning, however, was a large section on the left breast where it appeared a patch or insignia had been removed, leaving behind a noticeable discoloration and several small holes where attachment points had been. "The ceremony is in 3 weeks, General Hayes continued. "I know it's short notice, but I was hoping you might be able to restore this uniform to wearing condition. I understand if it's too challenging or if you don't have the time." Elena carefully took the jacket from the general's hands, feeling the weight of both the garment and the trust being placed in her. She examined the fabric more closely, running her fingers along the seams and testing the strength of the remaining threads. The jacket was well made, constructed in an era when military uniforms were built to last through multiple deployments and countless formal occasions. "The fabric is in good condition overall," Elena said thoughtfully. "The threading can be repaired, and I can reinforce these small tears without compromising the original appearance. The main challenge will be this area where the patch was removed." "Do you know what was originally there?" General Hayes's expression grew somewhat complicated, as if he were wrestling with a decision about how much to reveal. "There was a unit patch there, from my father's regiment in Vietnam. It was removed years ago, after some controversy arose about actions taken by that unit during the war. My father was proud of his service, but he felt it was better to remove the patch rather than have to constantly explain or defend decisions that were made in a very different time." Elena nodded understanding, recognizing the complex emotions that military families often carried regarding service in controversial conflicts. She had worked on enough vintage uniforms to know that each piece carried its own history, not all of it easy to bear. "I can repair the fabric where the patch was removed," she said carefully. "It will look like nothing was ever there. The uniform will be perfect for the ceremony." General Hayes seemed relieved by her confidence, but then he reached into his pocket and withdrew something that made Elena's heart skip a beat. It was a small, carefully preserved patch, wrapped in tissue paper. As he unwrapped it, Elena could see that it was indeed a unit insignia from the Vietnam era, with colors that had faded slightly but were still clearly visible. "I've been carrying this with me for years," General Hayes said quietly. "I found it among my father's things after he passed away 5 years ago. He kept it separate from the uniform, wrapped just like this. I think he wanted me to decide what to do with it." Elena looked at the patch, then, at the general's face, trying to understand what he was asking of her. The weight of the moment was not lost on her. This was clearly more than a simple uniform repair. This was about family legacy, about honoring service while navigating the complex realities of history. "Would you like me to reattach it?" she asked gently. General Hayes was quiet for a long moment, staring at the patch in his hands. "I honestly don't know," he admitted. "Part of me feels like I should honor my father's decision to remove it. But another part of me thinks that his service, whatever unit he was in, deserves to be acknowledged. He was a good man who served his country with honor, regardless of what others in his unit may have done." Elena could see the struggle in the general's eyes, the weight of trying to balance respect for his father's memory with the complexities of historical context. She had no military experience herself, but she understood family loyalty and the desire to honor those who had come before. "Perhaps," she suggested carefully, "you don't have to decide right now. Let me work on restoring the rest of the uniform first. By the time I'm finished with the repairs, you may have a clearer sense of what feels right for the ceremony." General Hayes looked at her with something that might have been gratitude. "That's very thoughtful of you, Ms. Martinez. Yes, let's proceed that way. Focus on the restoration first, and we'll address the patch question later." As he prepared to leave, General Hayes paused at the door of the workshop. "Ms. Martinez, I want you to know that this uniform means a great deal to me. My father was my hero growing up, and wearing his uniform at this ceremony would be a way of honoring not just him, but all the veterans who served alongside him. I trust your skills completely, but I also trust your judgment. If you have any thoughts or suggestions as you work on this piece, please don't hesitate to share them." After the general left, Elena carefully hung the vintage uniform jacket on a special rack she reserved for delicate projects. She spent several more minutes examining every detail, making notes about the repairs that would be needed and the order in which she would tackle them. This was unlike any project she had ever undertaken, not because of its technical complexity, but because of the emotional weight it carried. As the afternoon wore on, Elena found herself thinking about her own family's military history. Her grandfather had served briefly in World War II, though he rarely spoke about his experiences. She remembered finding his old uniform in her grandmother's closet when she was a child, carefully preserved in a cedar chest along with a few medals and photographs. Her grandmother had explained that the uniform represented not just her grandfather's service, but a piece of their family's story that deserved to be remembered and respected. The parallel between her own family's experience and what General Hayes was going through was not lost on Elena. She understood the complexity of trying to honor military service while acknowledging that history is often more complicated than simple heroism or villainy. The uniform she had been entrusted to repair represented not just fabric and thread, but memory, legacy, and the ongoing struggle to make sense of the past while moving forward with dignity. As the workday came to an end, Elena carefully covered the vintage jacket with a protective cloth and locked her workshop. Tomorrow, she would begin the delicate process of restoration, but tonight she wanted to do some research. She planned to learn more about the unit patch General Hayes had shown her, to better understand the context of the controversy he had mentioned, and to educate herself about the broader history of the Vietnam conflict. Elena believed that understanding the full story behind the items she worked on made her a better craftsperson. Every stitch she placed would be informed not just by technical skill, but by respect for the human experiences that had shaped the uniform's history. General Hayes had trusted her not just with his father's uniform, but with a piece of his family's legacy. She was determined to be worthy of that trust. The walk home from the base took Elena through a quiet residential area where many military families lived. Children played in front yards while their parents prepared dinner, creating scenes of domestic tranquility that stood in stark contrast to the weight of the project she had just taken on. As she walked, Elena found herself wondering about General Hayes's father, about the young man who had once worn the uniform that was now in her care. What had he been like? What dreams had he carried with him when he first put on that dress uniform? What experiences had shaped his decision to eventually remove the unit patch, and how had that decision affected his relationship with his son? These questions swirled through Elena's mind as she prepared for what she knew would be one of the most important projects of her career. That evening, Elena sat at her kitchen table with her laptop, researching the Vietnam War and the various controversies that had surrounded different military units during that conflict. The internet provided a wealth of information, some of it contradictory, much of it emotionally charged. She read accounts of heroism and accounts of wrongdoing, stories of soldiers who had served with honor and soldiers who had made choices they later regretted. What struck Elena most forcefully was the realization that the men who had served in Vietnam were not so different from the soldiers she worked with every day on the base. They were young, often frightened, trying to do their duty while navigating situations that were far more complex than anything their training had prepared them for. The controversial actions that had led to the removal of certain unit patches were not the result of inherent evil, but of human beings trying to survive in an impossible situation. This understanding would inform every aspect of her work on General Hayes's father's uniform. Elena realized that her task was not just to repair fabric and reattach insignia, but to help a son navigate his relationship with his father's memory and his own understanding of service and sacrifice. The patch in question represented not just a military unit, but a young man's place in history and his son's ongoing struggle to honor that place while acknowledging its complications. As Elena prepared for bed that night, she felt the familiar mixture of anticipation and responsibility that always accompanied her most important projects. Tomorrow, she would begin the careful work of restoration, but she knew that the true challenge would not be technical. The true challenge would be helping General Hayes find a way to honor his father's memory while remaining true to his own values and understanding of right and wrong. The vintage uniform hanging in her workshop represented more than just fabric and thread. It was a bridge between past and present, between a father's service and a son's love, between the complexities of history and the ongoing need to move forward with dignity and respect. Elena had been entrusted with the care of this bridge, and she was determined to strengthen it rather than allow it to crumble under the weight of time and controversy. The next morning arrived with an unusual crispness in the air, as if the weather itself sensed the importance of the work Elena was about to begin. She arrived at her workshop earlier than usual, carrying a thermos of coffee and a small bag containing specialized tools she had collected over the years for working on vintage military uniforms. The base was still quiet, with only the essential morning staff beginning their routines, giving Elena the solitude she preferred for delicate projects. Elena began by carefully removing the vintage jacket from its protective covering and laying it flat on her largest work table. Under the bright morning light streaming through her window, she could see details that had been less visible the day before. The craftsmanship of the original uniform was exceptional, with hand-finished seams and attention to detail that spoke of a time when military uniforms were constructed to last a lifetime. She photographed the jacket from multiple angles, documenting its current condition before she began any work. This was a habit she had developed early in her career, both as a way to track her progress and as insurance against any misunderstandings about the scope of work required. With a project as emotionally charged as this one, careful documentation seemed especially important. The first task Elena tackled was the stabilization of the loose gold threading along the jacket's edges and lapels. This required patience and an extremely steady hand, as she needed to secure the existing thread without adding any new material that might alter the uniform's authentic appearance. Using a magnifying glass and tweezers, she carefully worked each loose thread back into place, securing it with tiny, nearly invisible stitches. As she worked, Elena found her mind wandering to her research from the previous evening. She had spent hours reading about the various units that had served in Vietnam, trying to understand the context of the controversy General Hayes had mentioned. The more she learned, the more complex the situation became. Many units had served with distinction, earning recognition for their bravery and dedication. Others had been involved in incidents that, viewed through the lens of modern understanding, seemed questionable or worse. The unit patch that General Hayes carried represented one such complicated history. Elena had found references to the regiment in question, along with accounts of both heroic actions and controversial incidents. The picture that emerged was not one of clear heroes or villains, but of young men trying to survive in an impossible situation, sometimes making choices that seemed reasonable at the time but appeared questionable in hindsight. By mid-morning, Elena had completed the thread stabilization and moved on to addressing the small tears in the jacket's fabric. These required a different approach, as simply sewing them closed would create visible lines that would detract from the uniform's appearance. Instead, Elena carefully opened each tear slightly and inserted small patches of matching fabric from the inside, creating reinforcement that would be invisible from the outside while ensuring the repairs would hold under stress. This technique required fabric that matched not just the color and weave of the original, but also its age and weathering. Fortunately, Elena maintained a collection of vintage military fabrics that she had salvaged from uniforms too damaged to repair. She selected a piece that matched the jacket's material almost perfectly and began the delicate process of cutting and placing the interior patches. Around noon, Elena paused in her work to eat lunch and rest her eyes. As she sat at her small desk, eating a sandwich and reviewing her progress, she heard familiar footsteps approaching her workshop. The door opened to admit Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, one of the few soldiers on the base who had made an effort to get to know Elena personally over the years. "Good afternoon, Elena," Rodriguez said with a friendly smile. "I hope you don't mind me stopping by. I heard through the grapevine that you're working on something special for the general." Elena carefully covered the vintage jacket before responding. She had learned to be discreet about her work, especially when it involved high-ranking officers or sensitive projects. "I can't discuss specific projects, Sergeant, but I can tell you that I'm working on a restoration that requires my full attention." Rodriguez nodded understandingly. "Of course, I wouldn't expect you to share details. I was actually hoping you might have time to look at this." He held up a combat jacket with several tears and a missing patch. "We're deploying next month, and I'd like to have everything in perfect condition before we go." Elena examined the jacket briefly, noting that the repairs needed were straightforward and could be completed quickly. "I can have this ready for you by tomorrow afternoon," she said. "The tears are clean and the fabric is in good condition, so it should be a simple fix." As Rodriguez prepared to leave, he paused and looked around the workshop with obvious appreciation. "You know, Elena, a lot of us don't say it often enough, but your work means more to us than you might realize. When we're out there, having equipment and uniforms that we can trust completely makes a real difference. It's one less thing to worry about." After Rodriguez left, Elena returned to work on the vintage jacket with renewed focus. His words reminded her of her grandmother's teaching about the importance of every stitch, every repair. The soldiers who wore the uniforms she worked on were not just abstract figures, but real people who depended on her craftsmanship in situations where such details could matter enormously. The afternoon was spent working on the most challenging aspect of the restoration, the area where the unit patch had been removed. The fabric in this section showed clear signs of fading and were patterns that outlined where the patch had been attached. There were also several small holes where the patch's attachment points had been secured with tiny metal fasteners. Elena's approach to this area required careful consideration. Simply patching the holes and trying to blend the faded area would result in a repair that was obviously new and different from the rest of the uniform. Instead, she needed to find a way to restore the fabric's original appearance while maintaining the option for General Hayes to either leave the area blank or reattach his father's patch. The solution Elena developed was elegant in its simplicity. She carefully selected threads that matched various stages of the fabric's aging process and used them to create a subtle gradient that blended the faded patch area with the surrounding material. The small holes were filled with matching fabric and reinforced from behind, creating a smooth surface that would support either a new patch or remain invisible if left blank. This work required intense concentration and frequent breaks to rest her eyes and hands. Elena found herself entering an almost meditative state as she worked, each stitch placed with deliberate care and attention. The rhythm of needle and thread became a kind of prayer, a way of honoring both the uniform's history and the trust that General Hayes had placed in her skills. As the afternoon wore on, Elena became aware that she was not alone in the workshop. She looked up to see a figure standing quietly near the door, watching her work with obvious interest. It was Chaplain Morrison, an older man who served as one of the base's spiritual counselors and had a reputation for wisdom and discretion. "I hope I'm not disturbing you," Chaplain Morrison said softly. "I was walking by and couldn't help but notice the care you're putting into your work. It's quite remarkable to watch." Elena set down her needle and stretched her shoulders. "Thank you, Chaplain. This is a particularly important project, so I want to make sure everything is perfect. Chaplain Morrison moved closer to examine the jacket, though Elena was careful to keep the unit patch area covered. "If you don't mind me saying, I've seen many examples of fine craftsmanship over the years, but what you're doing here goes beyond technical skill. There's something almost sacred about the way you approach your work." Elena was touched by his words but felt a need to deflect the compliment. "I just try to treat every uniform with the respect it deserves. The people who wear these have put their trust in me, and I don't take that lightly." "That's exactly what I mean," Chaplain Morrison said with a knowing smile. "You understand that your work is about more than fabric and thread. You're helping people carry their stories with dignity." After the chaplain left, Elena found herself thinking about his words. She had never quite articulated it that way, but he was right. Her work was indeed about helping people carry their stories. General Hayes's father's uniform was not just a piece of clothing, but a vessel containing decades of memory, service, and complex family history. Her job was to ensure that vessel remained strong enough to carry that weight. The day's final task was to address the jacket's lining, which had developed several small tears and areas of weakness. This work was less visible but equally important, as the lining provided structure and support for the entire garment. Elena carefully reinforced weak areas and patched small tears, using techniques that would ensure the repairs remained invisible and durable. As evening approached, Elena stepped back to assess her progress. The transformation was already remarkable. The jacket that had appeared tired and fragile the day before now showed the dignified bearing of a well-maintained military uniform. The gold threading gleamed under the workshop lights, and the fabric had regained much of its original richness and depth. The most challenging work, however, still lay ahead. Elena had successfully prepared the canvas, but the question of the unit patch remained unresolved. She carefully wrapped the patch in its tissue paper and placed it in a secure drawer, where it would remain safe while General Hayes wrestled with his decision. That evening, Elena walked home through the base housing area, observing the families settling into their evening routines. Children played in yards while parents prepared dinner, and she could see the warm glow of lights beginning to come on in windows. These scenes of domestic tranquility reminded her that the military was not just an institution, but a community of real people with real lives and real concerns. At home, Elena continued her research into the Vietnam War, focusing particularly on the experiences of individual soldiers rather than the broader strategic and political issues. She read memoirs and oral histories, trying to understand what it had been like for young men thrust into an impossible situation thousands of miles from home. The picture that emerged was one of ordinary people trying to do their duty while navigating circumstances that challenged every assumption they had about right and wrong. One memoir particularly struck Elena. It was written by a veteran who had served in the same regiment as General Hayes's father, though in a different company. He described the confusion and moral ambiguity that characterized much of the Vietnam experience, where the lines between friend and enemy, right and wrong, were often impossible to distinguish. He wrote about good men who made questionable choices, and questionable choices that sometimes led to unexpectedly good outcomes. "We were kids," the veteran had written, "trying to stay alive and keep our friends alive in a situation that none of our training had really prepared us for. We made mistakes, and some of those mistakes had consequences that still keep me awake at night. But we also showed courage and brotherhood and sacrifice that I'm still proud of decades later. The two things aren't contradictory. They're both true, and they're both part of who we became." Elena found this perspective helpful as she considered General Hayes's dilemma about the unit patch. The patch represented both the pride and the pain of his father's service. To wear it would acknowledge not just the heroism, but also the complicated circumstances in which that heroism was demonstrated. To leave it off would honor his father's apparent decision to distance himself from the more controversial aspects of his unit's history. The following morning, Elena arrived at her workshop to find General Hayes waiting outside the door. He looked as if he had not slept well, and there was a tension in his bearing that suggested he was still wrestling with the decision about his father's patch. "Good morning, General," Elena said as she unlocked the workshop door. "You're welcome to come in and see the progress I've made." General Hayes followed her inside and watched as she carefully uncovered the vintage jacket. His reaction was immediate and emotional. The transformation Elena had achieved overnight was striking, and the uniform now looked almost exactly as it would have when it was new decades earlier. "Ms. Martinez," General Hayes said quietly, "this is extraordinary work. I can hardly believe this is the same jacket I brought you yesterday." Elena felt a flush of pride at his reaction, but she remained focused on the work still to be done. "I'm pleased with the progress, sir, but there's still the question of the patch area. I've prepared the fabric so that it can accommodate whatever decision you make." General Hayes examined the area where the patch had been removed, running his fingers over Elena's careful restoration work. "You can't even tell anything was ever there," he said with wonder. "How did you manage that?" Elena explained her technique for blending the faded area with the surrounding fabric, and how she had reinforced the attachment points without making them obvious. "The area is now ready for either a patch or to remain as is," she concluded. "Both options will look completely natural." General Hayes was quiet for several minutes, clearly still conflicted about what to do. Finally, he looked at Elena with an expression that seemed to be asking for guidance without actually voicing the request. Elena had been thinking about this moment since the previous day, and she had an idea that might help resolve the general's dilemma. "Sir, if I may make a suggestion, perhaps there's a third option we haven't considered." General Hayes looked at Elena with surprise and curiosity. In his years of military service, he had learned to value the perspectives of people who approached problems from different angles, and Elena's suggestion intrigued him. "I'm listening, Ms. Martinez. What did you have in mind?" Elena carefully retrieved the unit patch from her desk drawer, unwrapping it with the same reverence she had observed in General Hayes the day before. "I've been thinking about what this patch represents, not just to you and your father, but to all the men who served in that unit. It seems to me that the controversy surrounding the unit shouldn't erase the individual service and sacrifice of the soldiers who were part of it." She held up the patch, examining its faded but still distinctive colors and insignia. "What if we approach this differently? Instead of deciding whether to display the patch or hide it, what if we found a way to honor your father's service while acknowledging the complexity of that service?" General Hayes remained silent, but Elena could see that she had his full attention. She continued, choosing her words carefully. "I've been researching Vietnam War memorials and commemorations, and I've noticed that many of them focus on honoring the individual soldiers while acknowledging the difficult circumstances they faced. The Vietnam Veterans Memorial in Washington, for example, lists every name without regard to the controversies surrounding the war itself." Elena paused, gathering her thoughts before presenting her idea. "What if we created a custom display case for your father's uniform? The jacket could be exhibited with the patch displayed alongside it, rather than attached to it. This way, both elements of your father's story would be preserved and honored, but visitors would understand that they represent the complexity of his service rather than a simple celebration of it." The suggestion clearly caught General Hayes off guard. He had been so focused on the binary choice of wearing the patch or leaving it off that he hadn't considered alternatives that might honor both his father's pride in his service and his apparent later reservations about certain aspects of that service. "That's a very thoughtful suggestion," General Hayes said slowly. "But the ceremony I mentioned is specifically for veterans to wear their dress uniforms. A display case wouldn't serve that purpose." Elena nodded, understanding the limitation of her first suggestion. "You're absolutely right, sir. Let me think about this differently." She examined the patch more closely, noting its construction and the way it had been originally attached to the uniform. "There might be another approach," Elena said after a moment of consideration. "What if we modified the patch itself? Not permanently, but in a way that acknowledges both your father's service and the complexity of that service." She moved to her supply cabinet and retrieved a small piece of black ribbon, approximately an inch wide. In military tradition, black ribbons or bands are sometimes used to indicate mourning or reflection. What if we were to attach a small black ribbon to one corner of the patch? It would be subtle, but it would signal to anyone who understands military symbolism that you're honoring your father's service while acknowledging the difficult circumstances and controversial events associated with his unit. General Hayes examined the ribbon Elena had selected, turning it over in his hands as he considered the implications of her suggestion. So the patch would still be displayed, showing pride in my father's service, but the black ribbon would indicate acknowledgement of the more troubling aspects of the unit's history? Exactly, Elena confirmed. It would be a way of saying that you honor your father's individual service and sacrifice while recognizing that service took place in a context that included both heroism and tragedy. The black ribbon would show that you haven't forgotten or ignored the controversial aspects, but that you believe your father's personal honor transcends those controversies. The general was quiet for several minutes, clearly weighing Elena's suggestion against his own conflicted feelings about his father's service. You know, Ms. Martinez, my father and I never had a direct conversation about his decision to remove this patch from his uniform. I was young when he made that choice, and by the time I was old enough to understand the implications, he seemed reluctant to discuss it. Elena listened carefully, recognizing that General Hayes needed to work through his feelings aloud before making a decision. She had learned from her grandmother that sometimes the most valuable service one could provide was simply to listen with full attention and without judgment. I remember finding the patch among his things after he died, General Hayes continued. It was wrapped carefully, preserved with obvious care, but kept separate from his other military memorabilia. At the time, I thought maybe he was ashamed of his service, or that he regretted something he had done during the war. The general paused, looking at the patch with an expression that Elena recognized as profound sadness mixed with love. But the more I've thought about it over the years, the more I believe he removed the patch not because he was ashamed of his own service, but because he didn't want his individual honor to be confused with collective actions that he couldn't defend or explain. Elena found this interpretation both moving and insightful. It suggested that General Hayes's father had been grappling with the same kind of moral complexity that she had been reading about in her research. That sounds like the reasoning of a man with a very strong moral compass, she said quietly. He was, General Hayes replied with certainty. My father was one of the most principled men I've ever known. He taught me about honor, duty, and service through his example every day of his life. Whatever happened in Vietnam, I know he conducted himself with integrity. Elena could see that General Hayes was moving toward a decision, and she wanted to support him without pushing him in any particular direction. Your father sounds like a man who understood that true honor sometimes requires making difficult choices, even when those choices come with personal costs. Yes, General Hayes said with growing conviction. And I think his choice to preserve this patch while keeping it separate from his uniform was another such choice. He was maintaining his connection to his brothers in arms while distancing himself from actions he couldn't support. Elena waited while General Hayes worked through the implications of this understanding. She could see that he was approaching a resolution to his dilemma, and she wanted to give him space to reach his own conclusion. I think your suggestion about the black ribbon is perfect, General Hayes said finally. It would allow me to honor my father's service and his moral courage simultaneously. The patch would show that he served with distinction, and the ribbon would show that he served with conscience. Elena felt a deep satisfaction at helping General Hayes find a path forward that honored both his love for his father and his own moral standards. I think that's a beautiful way to commemorate his service, sir. Would you like me to proceed with attaching the ribbon to the patch? Yes, General Hayes said without hesitation. But I'd like to be here while you do it, if that's acceptable. This feels like something I should witness. Elena was touched by his request. Of course, sir. It would be an honor to have you present. Elena carefully selected a piece of black ribbon that matched the weight and texture of the patch's existing materials. She cut a small piece, approximately 2 inches long and half an inch wide, designed to be folded and attached to one lower corner of the patch in a way that would be clearly visible but not overwhelming. As she prepared to attach the ribbon, Elena explained her technique to General Hayes. I'm going to use a method called blind stitching, which will secure the ribbon without creating visible stitch lines on the front of the patch. The attachment will be permanent but subtle, in keeping with the military tradition of understated modifications to uniforms and insignia. General Hayes watched intently as Elena worked, clearly understanding the significance of this moment. You know, Ms. Martinez, I realize that you've helped me solve a problem I've been wrestling with for 5 years. I had been thinking about this as a choice between honoring my father and acknowledging uncomfortable truths, but you've shown me that the two aren't mutually exclusive. Elena paused in her work to look at the general. Sometimes the most powerful way to honor someone is to acknowledge the full complexity of their experience. Your father was clearly a man who understood that complexity, and I think he would appreciate the way you've chosen to commemorate his service. The attachment of the ribbon took only a few minutes, but Elena worked with deliberate care, understanding that this small modification carried enormous emotional weight. When she finished, she held up the completed patch for General Hayes to examine. The black ribbon was subtle but unmistakable, creating a visual statement that was both respectful and reflective. The patch still displayed the unit's insignia and colors with appropriate military pride, but the ribbon added a note of solemnity that acknowledged the complicated circumstances of the unit's service. "It's perfect," General Hayes said with obvious emotion. "It says everything that needs to be said, without saying too much." Elena was pleased with the result, but she remained focused on completing the project properly. Now we need to decide how to attach the patch to the uniform. Do you want it positioned exactly where it was originally, or would you prefer a different placement? General Hayes considered the question carefully. "I think it should go exactly where my father originally wore it. He earned the right to wear it in that position, and I want to honor that." Elena nodded and began preparing the uniform jacket for the patch attachment. She had already prepared the area where the original patch had been removed, and now she needed to ensure that the new attachment would be both secure and appropriate for the formal ceremony where the uniform would be worn. "One thing to consider, sir, is that this will be the first time this patch has been on this uniform in many years," Elena said as she worked. "When your father wears this uniform at the ceremony, it will represent a reunion of sorts between him and the symbol of his service." General Hayes seemed struck by this observation. "I hadn't thought of it that way, but you're right. In a sense, I'll be helping my father and his younger self have a conversation across the decades." As Elena positioned the patch on the uniform, she could see how perfectly it completed the jacket's appearance. The modified patch with its black ribbon looked both proud and reflective, exactly capturing the complex emotions that General Hayes wanted to convey at the veterans' ceremony. "The attachment process will take about 30 minutes, Elena explained as she began securing the patch. "I want to make sure it's completely secure, since dress uniform regulations require that all insignia be attached to military specifications." While Elena worked, General Hayes shared more stories about his father and their relationship. He described a man who had been deeply committed to his family and his principles, but who had carried certain burdens from his military service that he never fully shared with his son. "I think he was protecting me from some of the harder realities of war," General Hayes said. "He wanted me to understand the honor and duty aspects of military service without having to grapple with some of the moral ambiguities he had experienced." Elena listened while maintaining her focus on the precise placement of each stitch. She understood that General Hayes was working through decades of questions about his father, and that this conversation was as important to him as the physical restoration of the uniform. "It sounds like he was trying to give you the ideals of military service while sparing you the trauma of its realities," Elena observed. "That seems like a very loving thing to do." "It was," General Hayes agreed. "But I think I'm finally old enough and experienced enough to appreciate both aspects of his legacy. The uniform with this modified patch represents both the idealism and the realism of his service." As Elena completed the final stitches attaching the patch to the uniform, she felt a profound sense of satisfaction. This project had challenged her not just technically, but emotionally and intellectually. She had needed to understand military history, family dynamics, and moral philosophy in order to help General Hayes find an appropriate solution to his dilemma. "It's finished," Elena announced, stepping back to allow General Hayes to see the completed uniform. The transformation was remarkable. The vintage jacket now looked dignified and complete, with every element properly restored and positioned. The unit patch with its black ribbon occupied its traditional place with appropriate pride, while the subtle memorial ribbon provided the note of reflection that General Hayes had wanted. General Hayes stood silent for several moments, clearly moved by seeing his father's uniform restored to its full glory. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a mixture of pride and gratitude that touched Elena deeply. "Ms. Martinez, you've given me back my father's uniform, but, more than that, you've helped me understand how to honor his memory in a way that acknowledges both his service and his values. I can't thank you enough for that. The week following the completion of General Hayes's father's uniform brought an unexpected change to Elena's routine. Word had somehow spread throughout the base about the exceptional restoration work she had performed, and she found herself receiving visits from soldiers she had never met before, each carrying uniforms or equipment that held special significance for them. Staff Sergeant Williams was the first of these unexpected visitors. She arrived at Elena's workshop carrying a carefully wrapped package that contained her grandfather's World War II uniform. "Ma'am, I heard about the work you did for General Hayes, and I was wondering if you might be able to help me with something similar," she said, her voice carrying a mixture of hope and uncertainty. Elena unwrapped the package to reveal a uniform that was even older than General Hayes's father's jacket. The fabric showed significant age-related deterioration, and several components were missing entirely. The challenge would be considerable, but Elena could see that the uniform had been lovingly preserved and that it held deep meaning for Staff Sergeant Williams. "My grandfather served in the Pacific Theater," Williams explained. "He never talked much about the war, but he kept this uniform his entire life. After he passed away last year, my family asked me to take care of it, since I'm the only one who followed him into military service." Elena examined the uniform carefully, making mental notes about what restoration would be possible and what elements might be too damaged to save. The jacket was in relatively good condition, but the trousers had several large tears, and the original insignia had been removed at some point, leaving only faint outlines where they had been attached. "The biggest challenge will be finding period-appropriate materials and insignia," Elena explained. World War II uniforms used different fabrics and manufacturing techniques than modern military clothing. "I'll need to do some research to ensure any restoration work maintains historical accuracy." Williams nodded understanding. "I'm not in any hurry, ma'am. I just want to make sure it's preserved properly so it can be passed down to future generations of our family." As Elena worked on scheduling time for this new project, she realized that her workshop was becoming something more than just a uniform repair facility. Soldiers were beginning to see her as someone who could help them maintain connections to their family histories and military traditions. The responsibility was both humbling and inspiring. The next visitor was Corporal Jackson, a young soldier who had recently returned from deployment overseas. He carried with him a combat uniform that had been damaged during a vehicle explosion, but which had also probably saved his life. The uniform bore scorch marks and tears that told a story of survival and bravery. "I know this might sound strange, ma'am, but I'd like to have this uniform repaired so I can keep it," Jackson explained. "It's not something I'd ever wear again, but it represents something important to me. It's proof that I was there, that I served, and that I came home." Elena understood immediately. This was not about making the uniform wearable again, but about preserving a piece of personal history that had profound meaning for the young soldier. The scorch marks and tears were not flaws to be eliminated, but essential elements of the garment's significance. "What kind of preservation are you thinking about?" Elena asked carefully. "Would you want the damage repaired, or would you prefer to stabilize the uniform so the damage remains visible but doesn't continue to deteriorate?" Jackson considered her question thoughtfully. "I think I'd like the damage to remain visible, but I want to make sure the uniform doesn't fall apart over time." "Does that make sense?" "Perfect sense," Elena assured him. "There are conservation techniques that can stabilize damaged fabric without altering its appearance. The uniform would remain exactly as it is now, but it would be protected against further deterioration." As the week progressed, Elena found herself working on an increasingly diverse collection of projects. Each uniform told a different story, and each required a different approach to restoration or preservation. She was learning about military history spanning several decades, and she was also learning about the deeply personal ways that soldiers and their families connected to that history. The technical challenges were considerable, but Elena discovered that her years of experience with various fabrics and construction techniques had prepared her for this kind of specialized work. More importantly, her ability to listen to the stories behind each uniform and understand what the owners hoped to achieve helped her develop restoration approaches that honored both the historical significance and the personal meaning of each garment. On Thursday afternoon, Elena received a visit that surprised her more than any of the others. General Hayes returned to her workshop, but this time he was not alone. He was accompanied by Colonel Martinez, the base's senior logistics officer, and a woman in civilian clothes who introduced herself as Dr. Sarah Chen, a curator from the National Museum of Military History. Ms. Martinez, General Hayes began formally, "I hope you'll forgive the unexpected visit, but Colonel Martinez and Dr. Chen have some questions about your work that I thought you should hear directly." Dr. Chen stepped forward with obvious enthusiasm. "Ms. Martinez, General Hayes showed me photographs of the restoration work you performed on his father's uniform, and, I have to say, it's some of the finest military textile conservation work I've ever seen." "I understand you're entirely self-taught?" Elena felt a mixture of pride and nervousness at the unexpected praise. "Yes, ma'am. I learned basic sewing from my grandmother, and I've developed my military uniform techniques through practice and research over the years." Dr. Chen nodded approvingly. "What you've accomplished is remarkable. The attention to historical accuracy, the quality of the workmanship, and especially your sensitivity to the personal and historical significance of the garments shows a level of understanding that's quite rare." Colonel Martinez spoke up. "Ms. Martinez, we've been discussing the possibility of formalizing your role here on the base. Currently, you're classified as a general maintenance technician, but your actual work is much more specialized and valuable than that classification suggests." Elena was intrigued but uncertain about what they were proposing. "What kind of formalization did you have in mind, sir?" General Hayes answered her question. "We'd like to create a new position for you, Base Heritage Conservation Specialist. This would recognize your unique skills and give you the resources to expand your work with historical military uniforms and equipment." Dr. Chen added, "The position would also include collaboration with museums and historical societies. There's a real need for someone with your skills to help preserve military heritage items, both for individual families and for public institutions." Elena was overwhelmed by the unexpected recognition and opportunity. She had always thought of her work as simply doing her job well, but it seemed that others saw it as something more significant. "I'm honored by your confidence in my work," Elena said carefully, "but I'm not sure I understand what this new role would involve. Would I still be able to help individual soldiers with their personal projects?" "Absolutely," Colonel Martinez assured her. "In fact, that would be an important part of your responsibilities. We've realized that helping military personnel maintain connections to their heritage and family traditions is actually a valuable service that supports morale and unit cohesion." Dr. Chen explained further. "You would also have opportunities to work on museum pieces, to develop educational programs about military textile history, and to train other conservation specialists in military-specific techniques. Your workshop would become a resource for the entire region." Elena felt a rush of excitement at the possibilities being described, but she also felt the weight of responsibility that would come with such recognition. "When would you need an answer about this position?" "Take all the time you need to think about it," General Hayes said. "This is a big change, and we want you to be comfortable with whatever you decide." After the three officials left, Elena sat alone in her workshop, surrounded by the uniforms and equipment that had become her life's work. The vintage jacket that had started this chain of events hung nearby, now perfectly restored and ready for General Hayes to wear at the upcoming veteran ceremony. Elena thought about her grandmother, who had taught her that every stitch was a promise to the person who would wear the finished garment. The new position being offered to her would allow her to make that promise to many more people, to help preserve military heritage for future generations, and to continue learning about the stories that uniforms could tell. That evening, Elena called her grandmother to discuss the unexpected opportunity. At 87, her grandmother remained sharp and insightful, and Elena valued her perspective on important life decisions. "Mija," her grandmother said after Elena had explained the situation, "when I was teaching you to sew all those years ago, I never imagined you would become an expert on military uniforms. But I'm not surprised that you found a way to use your skills to help people preserve their family stories." Elena smiled at her grandmother's characteristically supportive response. "I'm excited about the opportunity, but I'm also nervous about taking on so much responsibility. Remember what I always told you about sewing, her grandmother said gently. Start with one stitch, then another, then another. Before you know it, you've created something beautiful and strong. This new job is the same. You don't have to master everything at once. Just start with one project, then another, then another. The following Monday, Elena made her decision. She accepted the position of Base Heritage Conservation Specialist, with the understanding that she would gradually transition into the expanded role while continuing to serve individual soldiers who sought her help with personal projects. Her first official act in the new position was to complete the final preparations for General Hayes to wear his father's uniform at the Veterans Ceremony. Elena personally delivered the restored uniform to the general's quarters, ensuring that every element was perfect and properly positioned. Ms. Martinez, General Hayes said as he examined the completed uniform, "I want you to know that this uniform represents more than just exceptional craftsmanship. You've helped me find a way to honor my father's memory that I never could have discovered on my own." Elena felt a deep sense of satisfaction as she prepared to attend the Veterans Ceremony where General Hayes would wear his father's uniform for the first time. She had been invited to the ceremony in recognition of her role in preserving military heritage, and she was looking forward to seeing the uniform in its proper context. The ceremony was held on a crisp Saturday morning in the base's main parade ground. Hundreds of veterans from multiple conflicts had gathered to honor their service and remember their fallen comrades. Elena was struck by the dignity and solemnity of the occasion, and by the obvious pride that the veterans took in their military heritage. When General Hayes appeared in his father's restored uniform, Elena felt tears come to her eyes. The vintage jacket looked magnificent, and the modified unit patch with its black ribbon struck exactly the right note of honor and reflection. Several other veterans commented on the uniform's exceptional condition and asked General Hayes about its history. Elena watched from the audience as General Hayes spoke about his father's service and the complex legacy of the Vietnam War. He mentioned the importance of honoring individual service while acknowledging the difficult circumstances that military personnel sometimes faced. His words were thoughtful and respectful, and Elena could see that they resonated with veterans from multiple generations. After the ceremony, Elena was approached by several veterans who had learned about her work and wanted to discuss their own uniform preservation needs. Each conversation revealed another family story, another piece of military heritage that deserved to be preserved and honored. As Elena walked back to her workshop that afternoon, she reflected on how much her life had changed in just a few weeks. What had started as a routine uniform repair had become the foundation for an entirely new career path. She was no longer just a seamstress working in quiet anonymity, but a recognized expert in military heritage conservation. The responsibility was daunting, but Elena felt ready for the challenge. She had her grandmother's wisdom to guide her, her own developing expertise to rely on, and a growing understanding of how important her work was to the military community. Every stitch she made would continue to be a promise, but now that promise extended far beyond individual uniforms to encompass the preservation of military heritage for future generations. Elena's workshop would never again be just a place where uniforms were repaired. It had become a repository of military history, a place where stories were preserved along with the uniforms that carried them. And Elena had become the guardian of those stories, ensuring that they would continue to be told with dignity and respect for years to come. 6 months after the Veterans Ceremony, Elena's expanded workshop had become one of the most respected military heritage conservation facilities in the region. The small room that had once been her quiet sanctuary had been relocated to a larger space in a newly renovated building, complete with climate-controlled storage areas, specialized lighting, and equipment that she could have only dreamed of in her previous position. The transformation had not happened overnight, and Elena had worked tirelessly to ensure that her new responsibilities didn't compromise the personal touch that had made her original work so meaningful. She still accepted projects from individual soldiers and their families, but now she also worked with museums, historical societies, and educational institutions throughout the country. On a warm Tuesday morning in spring, Elena was carefully examining a Civil War-era uniform that had been donated to the National Museum of Military History. The garment was incredibly fragile, with fabric that threatened to disintegrate at the slightest touch, but it represented a piece of American military history that deserved to be preserved for future generations. As she worked, Elena reflected on how much she had learned over the past months. She had taken courses in textile conservation, studied historical manufacturing techniques, and collaborated with experts from around the world. Her natural skills had been refined and expanded, but she had never lost sight of her grandmother's fundamental lesson about treating every garment as a promise to the person who would wear it. A knock at her workshop door interrupted Elena's concentration. She looked up to see a young woman in civilian clothes, probably in her early 20s, holding a carefully wrapped package. The woman appeared nervous, as if she wasn't certain she had come to the right place. "Excuse me," the woman said hesitantly, "are you Elena Martinez? I heard that you help people with military uniforms, and I have something that I hope you might be able to help me with." Elena set down her magnifying glass and invited the young woman into her workshop. "I'm Elena, and, yes, I work with military uniforms and equipment. Please, come in and tell me how I can help you." The woman introduced herself as Jessica Patterson, and, as she unwrapped her package, Elena could see that she was fighting back tears. Inside the wrapping was a Vietnam War-era uniform that was in remarkably good condition, along with a collection of military documents and photographs. "This belonged to my grandfather," Jessica explained, her voice shaking slightly. "He died when I was very young, and my grandmother kept his uniform in a closet for decades. She passed away last month, and, when we were going through her things, we found this along with a letter that she had written but never sent." Jessica handed Elena an envelope that showed signs of age and handling. The return address was in a handwriting that Elena recognized as belonging to someone from an older generation, with the careful penmanship that was once taught in schools but was now rarely seen. "My grandmother wrote this letter to my grandfather's commanding officer in 1971, Jessica continued. "She never sent it because she was afraid it might cause problems for our family, but she kept it all these years along with his uniform." Elena carefully opened the envelope and read the letter inside. It was a heartbreaking document, written by a young widow trying to understand why her husband had come home from Vietnam so changed, why he had nightmares and periods of silence that seemed to stretch for weeks, and why he had died so young from what the doctors called complications related to his military service. The letter revealed that Jessica's grandfather had been exposed to chemical agents during his service in Vietnam, and that his widow believed this exposure had contributed to his early death. She had wanted to contact his commanding officer to ask questions about what had happened to her husband during the war, but fear and grief had prevented her from sending the letter. "I've been researching my grandfather's service record," Jessica said, wiping away tears. "I've learned that he served in areas where Agent Orange was used, and that many veterans from his unit developed health problems similar to what he experienced. I want to do something to honor his memory and to acknowledge what he went through." Elena felt a familiar tug of empathy and purpose. This was exactly the kind of project that had drawn her into military heritage conservation in the first place. Jessica's grandfather's uniform was not just a piece of clothing, but a symbol of service and sacrifice that deserved to be preserved and honored. "What did you have in mind?" Elena asked gently. "Are you thinking about preserving the uniform, or did you want to do something more comprehensive?" Jessica had clearly given this considerable thought. "I'd like to have the uniform properly preserved, but I also want to create some kind of memorial or display that tells his story. I know he was proud of his service, but I also know he suffered because of it. I want both aspects of his experience to be acknowledged." Elena examined the uniform carefully, noting its excellent condition and the various insignia and decorations that indicated Jessica's grandfather had served with distinction. The unit patch was clearly visible, and Elena recognized it as belonging to a regiment that had indeed served in areas heavily affected by chemical defoliation operations. "This is a beautiful uniform," Elena said, "and it's been very well preserved. Your grandmother clearly took excellent care of it. As for creating a memorial display, I think we can develop something that honors both your grandfather's service and acknowledges the challenges he faced afterward." Over the following weeks, Elena worked closely with Jessica to develop a comprehensive memorial project. The uniform was carefully cleaned and stabilized using conservation techniques that would ensure its preservation for decades to come. Elena also helped Jessica research her grandfather's military records and unit history, developing a complete picture of his service and the conditions he had faced.
The memorial display that emerged from their collaboration was both moving and educational.
The preserved uniform was mounted in a custom case alongside Jessica's grandmother's unsent letter, photographs from her grandfather's service, and documentation about the long-term health effects experienced by veterans who had been exposed to chemical agents during the Vietnam War. Elena had suggested including information about other veterans who had faced similar challenges, making the display not just a personal memorial but an educational tool that could help people understand the complex legacy of the Vietnam War. Jessica enthusiastically embraced this approach, feeling that her grandfather's story could help honor all veterans who had faced similar struggles. The completed memorial was displayed at a local veterans center, where it attracted considerable attention from visitors and media. Jessica's courage in sharing her family's story inspired other families to come forward with their own experiences, and Elena found herself working on several similar projects that documented the long-term effects of military service on veterans and their families.
One of these projects particularly moved Elena.
A family approached her with a World War II uniform that had belonged to their father, along with documentation showing that he had participated in the liberation of Nazi concentration camps. The veteran had never spoken about this experience during his lifetime, but, after his death, his family had discovered journals and photographs that revealed the profound impact this service had on him. Elena worked with the family to create a display that honored their father's role in one of history's most important humanitarian missions, while also acknowledging the psychological burden he had carried for the rest of his life. The project required extensive research into historical records and careful collaboration with Holocaust education organizations to ensure accuracy and sensitivity. These projects taught Elena that military uniforms often carried stories that extended far beyond the individual service members who had worn them. Each garment represented not just one person's military experience, but the impact of that service on families, communities, and society as a whole. Her role as a heritage conservation specialist involved preserving and presenting these broader stories in ways that honored all aspects of the military experience.
As Elena's reputation grew, she began receiving requests from unexpected sources.
A documentary filmmaker contacted her about helping to authenticate and preserve uniforms that would be featured in a film about Korean War veterans. A novelist writing about World War II asked for her assistance in ensuring that the military details in his book were historically accurate. A high school history teacher wanted to develop a curriculum unit using Elena's preserved uniforms to teach students about the human cost of military service. Each of these collaborations expanded Elena's understanding of how military heritage conservation could serve educational and cultural purposes beyond simple preservation. She began developing programs that brought her work to broader audiences, including school visits where she would present uniform displays and discuss the stories they represented. One particularly successful program involved partnering with local libraries to create traveling displays that rotated throughout the region. These displays featured uniforms from different conflicts along with supporting materials that helped visitors understand the historical context and personal experiences represented by each garment. Elena's favorite aspect of these programs was the conversations they generated between veterans and younger community members. She had observed that uniforms seemed to break down barriers and create opportunities for veterans to share their experiences in ways that felt natural and comfortable. The physical presence of the uniforms provided a focal point that made abstract historical events feel real and personal.
During one library display, Elena witnessed a particularly moving exchange between a Vietnam veteran and a group of high school students.
The veteran had initially been reluctant to discuss his service, but when he saw Jessica's grandfather's uniform display, he began sharing his own experiences with chemical exposure and the long-term health effects he had experienced.
The students were fascinated and asked thoughtful questions about the veteran's service and its impact on his life.
Elena realized that her preservation work was facilitating exactly the kind of intergenerational dialogue that was essential for maintaining understanding and respect for military service across different periods of American history. As her first year as base heritage conservation specialist came to an end, Elena received an unexpected visitor. General Hayes returned to her workshop, but this time he was accompanied by his son, a young Army lieutenant who was preparing for his first deployment overseas.
"Ms. Martinez," General Hayes said, "I wanted to bring my son to meet you before he deploys.
I've told him about the work you did on his grandfather's uniform, and about how you helped me understand the importance of honoring military service while acknowledging its complexities. Lieutenant Hayes was clearly proud of his family's military tradition, but Elena could see in his eyes the same kind of thoughtful awareness that she had observed in his father. "Ms. Martinez, my dad told me about how you helped him resolve his concerns about wearing our grandfather's uniform.
I'm hoping that when I return from my deployment, I'll have stories that are worth preserving too."
Elena was touched by the young man's words and by the implicit trust that 3 generations of the Hayes family had placed in her work.
"Lieutenant, I'm certain that your service will be something your family can be proud of for generations to come.
And, when you're ready, I'll be honored to help preserve whatever uniform or equipment represents your experience." After the Hayes family left, Elena stood in her workshop surrounded by the uniforms and displays that had become her life's work. Each piece represented not just exceptional craftsmanship or historical significance, but human stories of service, sacrifice, and the complex realities of military life across multiple generations. Elena thought about her grandmother's teaching that every stitch was a promise to the person who would wear the finished garment. Over the past year, Elena had expanded that understanding to include promises to families, communities, and future generations who would learn from the stories that uniforms could tell. The small workshop where Elena had once worked in quiet anonymity had become a place where military heritage was preserved, honored, and shared with broader audiences. The silence in which she had once worked had been replaced by conversations, collaborations, and connections that extended her impact far beyond anything she could have imagined when she first began learning to sew at her grandmother's kitchen table. As Elena prepared to lock her workshop for the evening, she reflected on the unexpected path that had brought her to this point. A single uniform repair for General Hayes had led to recognition of her unique skills, opportunities for professional development, and a career that allowed her to preserve military heritage while serving the needs of individual service members and their families. Elena understood that her work would continue to evolve and expand, but she remained committed to the fundamental principles that her grandmother had taught her decades earlier. Every project would be approached with respect, every story would be honored with dignity, and every stitch would be placed with the understanding that it represented a promise to preserve something precious for future generations. The uniform that had started Elena's transformation still hung in her workshop, General Hayes's father's jacket, serving as a reminder of the power that military heritage conservation could have in helping people understand and honor the complexities of military service. The black ribbon that Elena had attached to the unit patch remained clearly visible, a symbol of the nuanced approach to military history that had become the hallmark of her work. Elena's story had begun with repairing uniforms in silence, but it had evolved into something much more significant. She had become a voice for military heritage, a bridge between past and present, and a guardian of stories that deserved to be preserved and shared. The silence in her workshop had been replaced by the conversations of visitors, the discussions of collaborators, and the quiet satisfaction of work that honored both technical excellence and human dignity. As Elena turned off the lights and prepared to head home, she could see the future stretching ahead of her, filled with uniforms to preserve, stories to honor, and promises to keep. Each day would bring new challenges and opportunities, but Elena felt confident in her ability to meet them with the same combination of technical skill, historical understanding, and respect for human experience that had made her work so meaningful. The general had indeed frozen when he first saw the patch that would eventually transform not just his father's uniform, but Elena's entire career. What had begun as a moment of uncertainty and family conflict had become the foundation for a new understanding of how military heritage could be preserved and honored in ways that acknowledged both pride and complexity, service and sacrifice, individual honor and collective responsibility. Elena's workshop would continue to be a place where uniforms were repaired, but it had also become something more, a sanctuary where military stories were preserved with dignity, where families found ways to honor their heritage, and where the broader community could learn about the human cost and meaning of military service across generations of American history.